Jacinda Ardern. How your official title is the Honorable Dame? What do I have? What is your official title?
I even struggle to tell you because
Go ahead, tell me.
I prefer people not to use it. So even the mere fact you want me to say it is problematic for me. Officially, it would be the Right Honourable Dame Jacinda. It's too much. It's too much.
Authoritarianism is on the rise. Democratic norms are fraying. And my guest today says it sometimes feels like the world is one big dumpster fire. But Dame Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, offers a different kind of power, one rooted in compassion and kindness. Now a fellow at Harvard, she's reflecting on her leadership in a new memoir called A Different Kind of Power and the upcoming documentary Prime Minister, out on June 13th. We're talking about leading through crisis, becoming a mother in office, and why she believes stepping away from power can be an act of strength and not weakness. And in a time of extreme disillusionment, she reminds us that optimism isn't naive. In fact, it's necessary. First of all, I'm so thrilled to meet you. I've been such an admirer of yours for many years, so I can't believe I'm finally getting a chance to sit down and talk with you.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me. And on, this special day, book's finally out in the world after 2 years.
I know. Do you feel like you had another baby?
Someone at the very beginning described to me the process of book writing in that way. It's terrible. You go through this journey and you're swearing to yourself that you will never do it again, and then it arrives and you're so overwhelmed and excited and happy that you forget and you do it again. So
are you saying there's another one in you?
No. I've a number of times swore off it as I was going through the process. Someone once told me never say never though, but I certainly don't have plans for another, other than the children's book, which is out at the end of September.
Oh, wow. So you do have another.
It's a very different experience writing a children's book.
Definitely.
Very
I've done both, and I would say writing a children's book is a lot more fun.
It's a lot more fun. It's simple and joyful is how I describe it, whereas this was therapy with a deadline.
I'm sure, and I'm so glad you wrote it. I think we all need a different kind of power now more than ever. So what is this different kind of power of which you speak?
Well, I think on the face of it, people will think, oh, okay, so it's just talking about different types of leadership. And to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, one of the things I wanted to share was what I believe to be the strengths of compassionate and empathetic leadership. And to also counter some of the assumptions that we have about those forms of leadership, especially in politics. They're so often equated with weakness or indecision or lack of resilience, and therefore as though you cannot succeed or thrive in politics if that's the leadership style that you subscribe to. So I wanted to push back against that notion. But I also wanted to share the strength that sits behind so many of those things that we often characterize as weakness.
Or female.
That is often true. But without, actually, I've met a number of people who I'd say have these same experiences. So imposter syndrome or empathy, we see weaknesses with those traits. I wanted to talk about the strength of those, the power of some of those traits.
And have you met men with those traits?
I have worked with them. I don't think that my colleague will mind me saying this, but I talk a bit about our finance minister who went on to become our deputy prime minister. He was someone with extraordinary empathy. During COVID, I remember him coming up to my office and just being distraught because he'd read a number of letters that morning that had come in from business owners who were struggling to see how they would survive during COVID. And he was so personally moved by every story. He was recounting to me what he'd read on the page and, was working through, would X policy make a difference for that person, or did we need to tweak Y policy? He was someone who was guided so much by compassion. So yes, I do see it in others, but there's not always the incentive in our system to spotlight that.
It seems to me, and I'm sure to many, many people in this country and in fact globally, Jacinda, and I know you tell people to call you Jacinda, so
I do.
I'm going
Thank
to
you.
do that. But this kind of power is, I would say, descendant, not ascendant. And the world does feel like a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
Strong men reign here and abroad. Did you feel there was a real urgency to write this book now, given what we're witnessing on a worldwide and certainly in this country?
I started writing after I left office. And actually it was a bit of a journey because I left the New Zealand Parliament in April 2023. And after I'd announced that I was standing down, I got the question about a book and I was quite vehement that I wouldn't do it. In part because I think, rightly or wrongly, political memoir is so often framed as being your opportunity to put your view on what happened in your own words, and whether you intend for it to be or not. I think that's naturally framed as being perhaps defensive or, trying to correct your critics. I didn't really feel like I wanted to do that or needed to do that. I feel that history's just going to tell your story no matter what or how you influence it. And then someone started, a friend really asked whether or not that had to be the kind of memoir that I wrote. And I really thought about that, this idea of instead using it as an opportunity to humanize leadership and speak to not just prospective politicians, but people who might self-exclude because they have doubts about their own leadership style. And I thought that's a book that I would feel motivated to write. And I felt that 2 years ago. That was at a time when, even then, and things have changed a lot since then, even then you didn't see much of a spotlight on alternative forms of leadership. But I still felt that was what voters were looking for. I felt that's what people were looking for. And I still feel it now. I think there's a disconnect between the leadership that we see and what people are seeking. And we've unfortunately, I think, interpreted that just because we have a certain type of leadership and power in different parts of the world, that's indicative of where everyone is at. And I don't believe that to be true.
But what do you think is causing that disconnect? Let me read this from a recent Washington Post article. A conservative nationalist backed by President Donald Trump was elected to Poland's presidency over the weekend, capping a string of tightly fought contests that analysts say underscore the growing strength of far-right and populist parties in Europe, fueled in part by the influence of the MAGA movement from across the pond. They're talking about the new president of Poland, a gentleman named Karol Nawrocki, I guess is how you pronounce his name. But it seems as if these strong men are gaining power all over the world, and we're seeing this trend toward autocracies, and yet you believe that's not what people want. Then I guess the question is, why is it happening then?
Yeah. So I think if we dig a little bit deeper into this question of, we're seeing there's two things at play. There's the issues itself that people are facing, and then there's the way that politicians are then choosing to respond to that. The issues are real. I think we have deep financial insecurity. We have a sense of disruption to our lives in the aftermath of COVID. That's deeply unsettling. Everything we thought you could rely on has been completely disrupted in our worlds, and regardless of where you're from. But also that old notion in politics of every generation perhaps being better off than the last. I don't think people believe that to be true anymore. And that is disruptive. Nor, in this rapid technological disruption, do I think people think that their livelihoods are secure. So in amongst all of that fear...
And immigration, by the way.
In amongst all of that fear and insecurity, there's a lot of power in the way politicians then articulate or try and make sense of that to a voter.
Or manipulate it?
Weaponize is what I would say. You have two choices when you're a politician, and you've got a situation where people are fearful. You can weaponize it and use blame, as we often see, and we're seeing in large parts of the world, blame of migrants, blame of others, those who are causing your financial insecurity. Or the alternative is that you actually answer the problem sitting in front of you, because there are very genuine issues that politicians should be tackling, but they won't be tackled with a soundbite. They will take work, thoughtful policy. I think collective multilateralism, there is still a place for that, because you cannot geographically isolate yourself from the impacts of disease, from climate, and nor can you only ever hurt your competitive with trade barriers. So that is the complexity of the world that we operate in, and I think what's happening.
But I feel like people, just having covered this for so long,
Yeah.
I feel that people aren't necessarily receptive. I mean, I'm making this massive generalization to complexities.
Yeah.
And they want simple answers. And because they're feeling fearful, that moves into anger.
Yes.
Because people are angry, that moves into being susceptible to that kind of weaponization. So how do we make people more receptive to an approach of problem solving,
Yes.
but also not otherizing and not blame?
Yeah,
I mean, I think
hear
that
you.
is the existential question of our time.
Because, why do politicians reach for those easy, simple messages? Because they're easy and simple. They can reach people.
And they work.
And they can really grab you. But the long-term consequence of that is actually dire for our society and our communities. And it actually doesn't solve the problem. So whether or not this is a long-term political solution, that's a real question, because as soon as people see actually their lives aren't better or aren't different, then they go hunting again. This is really interesting to me. If you dig into the research from the last European elections, they looked at people who switched their voters to far-right parties and found that roughly only a quarter were doing so because they believed in the ideology. Others felt disenfranchised or felt that their system was broken, or there was a singular policy that might have attracted them to that. But that sends a message that actually at the moment there is this disquiet and people are looking around, casting around for the answers. And in Canada and in Australia, they elected 2 prime ministers who on election night chose to use their victory speeches to talk about kindness. And those were 2 individuals who were successfully elected by their people. I do think that there are a number of voters seeking an alternative, and particularly when we work really hard on delivering the answers and solutions people are looking for, that will make a difference.
Your book is an opportunity to tell your whole story and about your childhood. You grew up in Morrinsville. Is that, am I pronouncing it correctly? New Zealand. It's a rural dairy farming community. It's about 2 hours south of Auckland. Your dad was a police officer.
Yes.
Your mom worked in your school's cafeteria, and you and your sister Louise were the first in your family to go to college.
Yes.
Right? I mean, what do you think lit the spark in you, Jacinda? Or was it an ember that sort of started to grow in intensity over time? Because I know you were, like so many women and some men, were haunted by
Self-doubt.
self-doubt and of course imposter syndrome, like so many of us. But when did you decide, I'm going to be a leader?
I didn't.
It's kind of decided that you would be, right?
It's a great question, because we have this assumption that in politics, because it's such a cut and thrust place, that you must enjoy the sport of it yourself, and that in itself must be quite enticing. Whereas actually a lot of the politicians I've met, they're there in spite of the politics. They're there because they saw something in their community that they wanted to change, or something about, policy or law that they felt was unfair. There will be something that motivated them. For me, it was, even at the time, if I wouldn't have articulated it this way, I just, when I observed things that didn't feel fair, kids that didn't have some of the basic things that I had, that early experience, I think, probably just sparked a bit of a desire to be a part of making change. And also I was raised in a very service-orientated household, and politics to me, when done right, is an act of service. So if you wanted to be a part of making change, the best way to do it was to go and volunteer for a political party, and I did that. I didn't believe that I would end up front of house, as it were.
Right. You thought you'd be behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I thought I was reasonably well suited to that, even though actually sometimes even then I struggled with the intensity of the roles. But circumstance, random set of events, being asked often enough, all culminated in me finding myself in Parliament. But from there, the mantle of leadership was not only something I wouldn't seek, something I actively told people I did not want. Yeah.
And yet things changed really because of circumstances. But
Yeah.
before we talk about how you became an unlikely prime minister, you were almost crippled by anxiety and imposter syndrome and feeling that you weren't enough. And I wonder how through the years, because so many, particularly women, I think, feel that way, perhaps from cultural conditioning or societal norms, but how were you able to ultimately compensate for that? Or do you still feel like an imposter still?
Oh, yeah. It
Come
doesn't
on,
go
you
away.
were the Prime Minister
I
of
know.
New Zealand.
I share this story because it actually, it's quite comforting, but one of the female Prime Ministers I had the privilege of working for was someone called Helen Clark. She was incredible. She led New Zealand for 9 years, and after she left office, someone contacted, she just always came across to me as so self-assured, and she tells a story of someone calling her to suggest to her that she might consider becoming the head of the UN Development Program. And I was sitting in an auditorium when she gave her response. She said to them, "Oh, I'm not sure that I have enough experience in aid and development." And they said to her down the phone, "But Helen, you ran a country." And so as soon as I heard that, I thought, oh, so it's not just me who immediately moves to that, deficit approach of all of the reasons you can't do something. And I know I'm not alone in that.
No, and men always think they're overqualified, which is so hilarious. And women, if they look at themselves, they say the same thing. I couldn't do that. I'm not qualified.
Yeah, well, I mean, that didn't really change for me, but the way I see that trait has changed. And, you use the word anxious. I always just describe myself as a bit of a warrior. I'm the kind of person that if there's risk on the horizon, I'll immediately start planning for the strategies to manage that risk. Actually, that's probably quite helpful when you're in a leadership role. When you have a confidence gap, you just instinctively over-prepare. You want to know more about the issues so that you're ready to make decisions, and you'll bring in other people to help with advice and expert knowledge. That's also quite helpful when you're a leader. So I stopped seeing these things as weaknesses, so long as you're able to keep them in check, because I know for many those feelings can be crippling. And that's where I'd counsel, that's not beneficial. But if you are able to see the strengths, then maybe that is.
But you became Prime Minister when you were, 37
Yes, that's
years
right.
old, which is insane. And you became Prime Minister when you realized you were pregnant, right?
Well, and this is the I guess the real contrast. Everyone saw me as a young Prime Minister, but as an expectant mother, the medical term was geriatric. So
I had one of those too.
Yeah, it's so common. Why don't they
geriatric
change it?
pregnancy?
We should start the campaign here. I'm pro seasoned mother.
But I mean, I watched a documentary that's coming out soon, and you talk about this in your book, but I was in awe of your ability to manage everything. I mean, I think your husband Clark deserves a tremendous amount of credit
Absolutely.
for holding down the fort.
Absolutely.
and parenting, not babysitting,
Yes.
as some fathers still describe it.
Yeah.
But I do think, wow, that was intense.
It was, and I think this is one of the things that I'm so grateful that the documentary captures in a way that I tried to do in the book, but it just gives you that extra layer.
And the visual,
The intimacy of it.
It's very powerful.
It is, well, that was Clark picking up a camera and filming behind the scenes, just because, for no other reason than he just thought maybe this will be important. Maybe this will be, a moment in history of sorts. But what I'm really pleased he captured is, in amongst that notion, which probably invariably happens when there are so few people who have done a thing like, unfortunately, I was only the second woman in the world to have a baby while being in office.
Benazir Bhutto was
the
first.
other. And so you can, I think, sometimes feed that notion that women can do it all. And I wanted to demonstrate, yes, women can, but they shouldn't do it alone. And so I think the documentary shows I was never alone.
Right.
I was very well supported.
I know you were worried about framing it as you were a superwoman,
Yes.
and that, look, I can run a country
Easy
and raise a
breezy.
daughter.
Yeah, we should never lift the bar that high. That expectation's too much for anyone. In fact, I remember one of the things of the experience of becoming a mother. I would talk to my friend about this all the time. How do women do this on their own? How do they do it on their own? Those were the heroes. If I was ever going to talk about superwoman, it would be that group of women. And I started thinking about it in policy terms. What are our policies doing to support those parents? And of course, not all of them exclusively women. Those parents who are doing this job on their own, I want to do more to support.
Your daughter, Neve, I thought it was very funny when your mom was kind of like, Neve, that's an interesting name. What were some of the other choices? Which made me, translation, I'm not crazy about that name, Jacinda.
My mom is the most gorgeous human being. You could not ask for a more supportive mother, just amazing. And there's something so universal about that moment. Now she's very much, I love the name. I love the name.
It made me laugh, though.
Yeah, she's always had the ability, though, because of course with a parent you're always thinking about the well-being of your child. And I still remember the morning after one of our elections where we'd lost, but I was still in Parliament, but I was in the back, I was in the opposition again, and it was such a hard place to be, so dispiriting. Morning after, her coming into my room and sitting on the end of my bed and just saying, you still really want to do this? I was like, Mum, I just got elected yesterday. It's a 3-year contract. But she's just, always just been so supportive.
I know that that fall of 2018, after Neve was born, there was a photo of you holding her while seated on the floor of the UN General Assembly.
Such
went
terrible
viral.
Photos. So terrible.
Why?
Oh, well, you can see that we have... I was trying to explain this to someone. You can see that we don't know. There's some, if you look at the full spray, you can see I'm craning my neck around because all I could hear, this was not a full room. This was not the General Assembly in session. It was a special event for Nelson Mandela. And I'd just gone up and spoken, and we hadn't planned for Clark and Neve to come over, but she'd woken up from her nap. So he brought her over and there was lots of space. So they sat down on the floor when I came off from speaking. And I'm holding her, making stupid phases, just doing that thing. And I just hear tick, 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 tick. And you can't see the media. Up in the UN General Assembly, they're all behind closed, mirrored kind of rooms in an overhang. And I said to our ambassador at the UN, I said, what's that noise? He said, the media sit in those rooms. Oh. Do they? There I am back with making these awful faces. And so that moment that apparently was historic was just a very regular, spontaneous moment for us as a family.
But I think it became...
irregular, I should say.
But it became very symbolic, I think, of women's potential. Again, wanting to eschew this whole super woman moniker. It did, I think, help normalize the fact that leaders could be mothers.
Yeah.
And that women could both have children and lead a country.
But that it will always continue to be it won't always be linear and it won't always be easy. And that was also something that the book gave me a chance to share behind the scenes, because in amongst this, historic photo, I was really struggling with managing different time zones. Breastfeeding never came easy for me. And so there's this extra layer that was always going on. And in that extra layer is something very universal. That's a story for so many women. And I wanted to share that as well. Not for pity or compassion, but actually just to say it doesn't matter where your station is or your role or what you're doing. The experience of parenting is a great leveler. And maybe that will help humanize people in public life a little bit as well, because we could probably do with a bit of humanization of one another, perhaps.
The story behind the photo.
Yeah.
I think about the period of time, Jacinda, when you were the prime minister, and good Lord,
Yeah.
it was just one crisis after another. 6 months after you I think you truly burst onto the world stage 6 months later in March of 2019 when a far-right Australian man killed 51 worshippers at that mosque in Christchurch,
Yes.
live streaming the attack on Facebook. Tell me about the moment you heard this was happening and how you were able to summon the strength and the leadership that were so required at that moment.
Yeah, I remember that day so well. And of course, when you're first presented with information, you get it in bits. And so I was on my way. I was in a van with a local mayor on my way to visit a school when my press secretary handed me the phone and just said, there's been a shooting. And over the course of quite a short period of time, I learned that a mosque was involved, and they weren't sure whether or not it was a series of attacks, how coordinated it was, but just that information gave a really early insight as to perhaps what this might be. And it wasn't too much later that we heard that he'd prepared a manifesto just full of hate, and he'd sent it to my office. Learning that he had deliberately targeted people during Friday prayers in order to maximise the number of casualties. But not only that, he'd done it because he had an intention to try and create a war. He wanted there to be retaliatory acts. That was part of his plan, and also part of his plan was to become infamous himself. And so New Zealanders just rejected that, and as much as people make comment on the role that I had to play as Prime Minister, in many ways I simply saw myself as leading out what was a very New Zealand response, which was a complete rejection of what he had tried to do. An entire nation who were gripped and united by grief, and a Muslim community who showed such enormous grace towards New Zealanders in that moment, opened mosques, opened their arms, allowed us to join with them in that period of grief. It will forever be one of the most deeply moving and sad experiences I've had in my life. But I feel so humbled to have been in that role during that period as well. Yeah.
In a press conference after the attack, you said, quote, "Many of the people affected by this extreme violence will be from refugee and migrant communities. Yeah. New Zealand is their home. They are us."
Yeah.
And I think that phrase, "they are us," echoed around the world and did come to symbolize a different kind of leadership, particularly during a period when immigrants were being so demonized.
Yeah. Do you know, one of the things that that absolutely, so much during this period of events just crushed all of us, but learning that two of the victims, one was a father from Syria who had brought his family to New Zealand. Well, really, bought implies some kind of choice, but had come to New Zealand for the safety and sanctuary of being outside of Syria at that time. And he and his son died. And I felt such responsibility, because here we were, a nation that was meant to be a form of safe harbour for that family. And they lost their father and son, leaving behind a young girl, a sister, a daughter, another son who was injured, and their mother. I got to know that family a little bit, and the fact that they, amongst others, were victims just absolutely devastated me. So this idea that here we had a community that he intended when he undertook that attack to other our Muslim community. And I really credit New Zealanders for their view that they were just not going to let that happen, that it didn't matter how long you had called New Zealand home, it was home. It was home.
You describe a phone call with President Trump in your book after the attack, in which you discussed what might happen to the terrorists. And he asked you if you were calling the gunman that. You said to him, yes, this was a white man from Australia who deliberately targeted our Muslim community. We are calling him that.
Yeah.
Tell me what you felt during that exchange with President Trump.
Oh, I mean, it was really, in my mind, giving just the opportunity to give some context for why that language was important for us, because by default, by definition, if you're seeking to cause fear and intimidation amongst a wider group of individuals through your act, that's a terrorist act. And so it was very, we were clear-eyed on that, but we were also clear-eyed on the fact that we were not going to use his name. If he was seeking infamy, and he was part of a community of individuals who liked to see the repetition of their names in their attacks, well, we could deny him that. And for me, empathetic leadership, people-centered leadership, it is nothing without action. The idea that you're simply emoting is not enough. So there were two things that came from this horrific experience. One was the weapons that he used on that day, two AR-15s in particular, alongside other military-style semi-automatic weapons. He legally obtained them and then illegally modified them. But regardless, these were weapons designed to take lives en masse, and they did that. I remember visiting the hospitals and just coming away and seeing individuals who didn't have one gunshot wound. They had multiple wounds, devastating wounds, and in such a short amount of time. And so we were clear that our law needed to change, and so we changed it. All members of Parliament, bar one, voted in favour of a ban of military-style semi-automatic weapons within 27 days of the attack. And the second thing we did, he used social media, Facebook then specifically, to live stream his attack, and it was broadcast for 17 minutes. It was uploaded once every second on YouTube for the first 24 hours, and 1.5 million copies were removed from Facebook because, as I say, his intention was to intimidate, to motivate others to violence, to create this warfare, and that was one of his tools was social media. So we created something called the Christchurch Call to Action, bringing together governments, platforms, and civil society, first of its kind arrangement, to try and tackle radicalisation and violent extremism online. And it's still going to this day. I'm now the patron. A number of things have changed as a consequence, but anyone listening will know that work continues, and it is one of the, I think, great challenges we face.
You must look at this country, and we've had so many incidents of horrific gun violence at synagogues and schools and places of worship and shopping centers and movie theaters. I mean, I could go on. And yet, with some small changes during the Biden administration, it seems that we have not been able to muster the collective will to do anything about it, to make guns less available. I mean, the right to bear arms is sort of sacrosanct in this country. And watching as a New Zealander, Jacinda, now someone who lives in America, I mean, do you have a difficult time understanding why we haven't been able to do something? There's so many people who want it done, and yet it never happens.
Yeah. And I'm always careful commenting on other people's politics and policies, because there's sometimes just cultural differences and perspectives that I just won't fully understand. But we had high levels of gun ownership in New Zealand, but I think probably it's always been seen as, whilst access was important, particularly as food producers and farmers and hunters recreationally, it is still framed as a responsibility versus a right. And I also think that we're pretty pragmatic in New Zealand, and I think that when it came down to it, accessing guns was one thing. The type of guns was another. I kind of really challenged anyone to mount an argument for me as to why they needed an AR-15. If you're a duck shooter, you do not need an AR-15. If you're a hunter, pest management. So, New Zealanders took, I think, a really pragmatic approach, and so we did not take that law from nowhere. That came out of Australia, they had a horrific attack in Port Arthur, and a then Conservative Prime Minister by the name of John Howard instituted a ban on these same weapons, but also at the same time a buyback. And I really believe that was the right approach. At the time that people had acquired them, they'd done so legally. And so, therefore, we should compensate them. And so we paid, depending on the state of the gun, 80% of market value. People had that money into their accounts, and then we destroyed them. And for us, it was over 50,000 weapons.
After the mosque attack, then comes the pandemic. I'm like, wow, your timing really sucks, Jacinda.
It does. There was actually a volcanic eruption in between as well.
Oh, sorry.
It was a real time. It was. For New Zealanders. I remember.
Sorry, I didn't mention the volcanic eruption, and many people died who were not able to evacuate that island, right?
Well, actually, they did evacuate individuals, but those who remained, very sadly, had perished. And then we had to undertake a body recovery. It was a horrific time again. So New Zealand really went through a lot for a few years there. And
then, like the rest of the world, you go through the pandemic.
Correct.
And your handling of this crisis was heralded as a model of effective leadership, and I think contributed to your landslide re-election in 2020. But as time went on,
got hard.
Oh, hard.
Yeah.
I mean, impossible.
Yeah.
There was such a backlash. In early 2022, the grounds of Parliament in Wellington became the epicenter of a sprawling and volatile protest.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in the documentary someone says, this is not like Kiwis, the nickname for New Zealanders.
Yeah.
And where was this coming from and why?
And I think about that period a lot, because the context of when we had that occupation in Parliament was 6 days after the Canadian blockade started.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the convoy. So there was some conversation around the knock-on effect of that, because in the New Zealand context, we weren't using things like lockdowns anymore. We had reopened our borders. We were back into normal life. We were having our first real experience of COVID with Omicron, but we were doing so with a vaccination rate around 90%. So, and then this happened. And of course, the frame for those who came was vaccine mandates. We had required people who were working in healthcare, education around our borders and in the police force at their request to be vaccinated. And so, I think it is important to look at not only what the stated reason for that protest was, but also what might have sat underneath, because there's something universal about that latter part of the COVID experience for a lot of countries, not just us, a lot of countries. And, it was occurring in a time of, I think, deep anger over the experience of the pandemic. It was so hard, but also a lot of disinformation, a lot of stuff swirling from around different countries. We saw some of the conspiracies that exist in the world were on placards and signs down on our forecourt, the odd American flag and so on. So I think that there is a debate to be had beyond geographic boundaries over what do we do about disinformation, as well as looking at just our pandemic responses generally. We need to learn from them. Ours wasn't a perfect response. It saved an estimated 20,000 lives. We spent less time in lockdowns than, most countries. Our lives for large periods was relatively normal, but it still had an impact. It was still hard, and we need to learn from that experience.
In retrospect, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I've always thought that because you have in your mind the context in which you're making all those decisions, the imperfect information, it's really hard to say, well, I would have done that. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask the question. We put in place a Royal Commission. That's the most independent form of inquiry you can have in New Zealand. And we put experts on there and said, please go and tell us. You tell us objectively. And so they did, and they came back with a range of recommendations, and I don't disagree with any of them, but we have to be willing to learn, because this won't sadly be an isolated experience. I hope never again in my lifetime, but we have to be prepared.
The ugliness of some of those protesters was so upsetting to me. Sort of the placards and the threats against you, and just the meanness. Totally antithetical to what you're trying to promote in this book and in your style of leadership. And you describe one moment in an airport bathroom when a woman came up to you and said, "Thank you for ruining our country."
Yes.
You know, it is hard, and I'm assuming you just didn't take these things personally.
Yeah, gosh, it's, I remember, of course, the occupation was terribly difficult.
And then the kind of aftermath, Jacinda, where you had almost your own kind of January 6th, where the police
that was it itself, the occupation. And one thing I kept in mind, of course it wasn't everyone. And relative to our population size, it was a small portion, but, it was nonetheless, very confronting. But even then I would look out over that crowd some days and think, everything we'd done was about trying to save people's lives and protect people, but they think that's what they're doing. Some people believe the vaccine killed people, and so they thought they were trying to save lives. And so you could almost, even in those two completely different positions, see that, if half of what they were reading was true, I might feel that angry as well. But it's those two things. The fact that we sometimes now can't even agree on facts, that's extremely disruptive for democracies. And then the second, people's willingness to tip into violence is also, I believe in this, the research suggests, increasing. People think violence is justified now as a political act. Those are two very challenging situations that I do think need to be addressed.
So what do we do about it?
Well, I do two things. I don't think we should feel hopeless or a sense that there isn't work being done in community to try and bridge those divides. People talk about it as polarization. I see it more as entrenchment, a depth of feeling that is intransigent. But I've certainly come across groups that are working hard in their own communities to try and restore that respectful debate and that dialogue. The second thing is we do need to raise a generation who are not cynical but curious, who question what they see, who ask questions, who seek, alternative sources to really try and differentiate between the disinformation that they'll increasingly be exposed to over
Media
time.
literacy.
Indeed, but I do think we also need to hold accountable those who are publishers, not postmen. And at the moment we have a lot of platforms online who don't see themselves as responsible for that information environment. I believe in a free and open internet. I believe in freedom of speech, but things like disinformation, this is something else that we have to be willing to debate and talk about.
You announced your resignation in January 2023, saying you no longer felt you had enough in the tank to do the job justice. Take us inside that moment. I know this was a very hard decision for you.
It was.
And talk about what kind of put you over the edge. I mean, there were a few things leading up to it. I know that you had a little bit of a breast cancer scare.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe that's overstating it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I put it in the book, and someone asked me, "Why didn't you talk about this earlier?" And I said, because it wasn't the reason I left, and nor was it, so significant, or women have that kind of thing happen all the time. I didn't want to overstate it, but what it did do is suddenly give me a frame to think about, why when my GP said you need to go and have further testing, why was the first thing that came into my head. Maybe if this ends up being cancer, maybe I could leave. And as soon as it hit my, came into my mind, I thought that is a very dark way to think about this new information. And it made me realize that I had not entertained the idea because I felt such a sense of responsibility to be there, and that the only thing that was going to take me out of it was if I thought the choice was being removed. So that's the reason that moment was important, because suddenly I thought, well, maybe I need to think about this a bit more.
And then what was the thing that Was there one thing, or was
No.
it just a culmination of things?
There wasn't one thing, and some people talk about, the aftermath of COVID. I left 12 months after, we'd continued on with life. There was nothing politically particularly going on. Polling-wise, we were, a few points shy of where we were when I was elected. There was nothing particularly dramatic, and I wanted it that way because I think it's okay to leave without scandal or death or loss, but actually just because you know that you're not able to continue to be the type of leader that you need to be in that job. Sometimes there's a responsibility to leave.
Why do you think so many politicians have difficulty doing that? So many people stay too long at the fair. They don't want to give up the power, the prestige, whatever it is.
Too long at the fair. I love that turn of phrase. It makes it sound like it's a really good time. Too long at the gauntlet. I understand how it happens because obviously your team that surrounds you, they're really supportive. They really encourage you. And sometimes you can end up feeling like you'll be leaving people adrift if you go. And also it's a lonely decision. You can't talk to too many about it because if it gets out that you're thinking of leaving, that can be in itself, that can make the decision for you. And so I totally understand how it happens. And whilst I really hadn't thought about it, maybe by leaving it gave a little permission for people to think differently about departure. I don't know. All I know is no one really particularly supported me to leave, and so I had to do it in spite of the views of others. And so I can see how that happens for politicians. Yeah.
The pressure, and
the pressure
also people whose livelihood depends on your staying put.
Yeah.
It may inadvertently kind of pressure you to stay because they're thinking a lot about themselves, understandably.
And, for me it was, we were 1 year out from another election, and I believed, that we had so much more work to do on climate change, housing, child poverty, things that really mattered to me. So winning mattered to me because that was the only way to keep making a difference on those things. But it didn't mean I personally needed to win. And there was a part of me that thought, when you govern through COVID, you bring baggage. You do. It's the privilege and the price of the job. I ended up having to make decisions that I knew were unpopular. I knew they were unpopular and that I'd pay a price for them. But I thought if people survive this pandemic because of it, then that's worth it. But it did mean that I saw myself as a bit of a flashpoint for some people. And if leaving could bring the temperature down in politics, that would be worth it too.
It's hard to imagine, Jacinda, a politician more diametrically opposed to your style of governing and your desire to lead with compassion and kindness than the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. And as a former world leader, I'm curious what it's been like for you, especially now that you're at Harvard, which is in the crosshairs. What has it been like for you witnessing his behavior both in this country and his efforts to remake the global order in such a profound way?
As the previous leader of a small country who has long been affected by the engagement of others in multilateralism or an international rules-based order, it matters to me deeply whether or not we have a grave departure of that sense of collective responsibility. When I think about some of the significant challenges that we face, pandemics don't respect borders, neither does climate change, and our economic exposure generally. We are so connected now, and the idea that we can govern in a way that ignores that successfully, I don't believe that to be true. I don't believe that to be true because of how connected now we are. But that's a view I'll share universally, regardless of who's in power or what country I'm speaking to. You have to, of course, as a politician, satisfy the domestic needs of the people who elected you to serve them. But I believe you're best able to do that whilst acknowledging the connection that we have with others. The second thing for me, though, I never really saw myself on departure as going into the leadership space. I thought there's plenty of people who are well seasoned in the practice of leadership to talk about what's needed and the practice of leadership itself. But because there was so much conversation around different forms in politics, I was convinced to start a fellowship on empathetic leadership. And it has been one of the most satisfying things I've been involved with since I left, because there are politicians out there who are doing things differently, but you won't see them in headlines. You won't see them always in lights, even though they're often quite senior, because our system, we gravitate towards reading and seeing and experiencing and feeling the rage of the extremes. I want to spotlight the alternative because it is there. And I think it needs to be acknowledged and given half a chance. I think voters will seek to reward it as well.
As someone who's at Harvard, I mean, Harvard is under incredible pressure, as I mentioned, in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. What do you think about Harvard's pushback and refusal to acquiesce to some of the things that the administration is asking for, and in fact suing the Trump administration? And what is it like being at Harvard right now?
So I'm obviously not at the centre. I'm not a member of faculty.
I know you're not speaking on behalf of
Harvard.
Yeah,
indeed. So I think that's an important point to make. I'm merely there as a fellow, and undeniably, obviously, there's a tense environment in this moment in time. All I can reflect on is my own time in leadership and in politics back in New Zealand. There was separation between government and higher education. I've always seen higher education, as we call it in New Zealand, or tertiary education, as almost being, it's always a conscience. It's always there as a commentary on where we are in society and politics, history, our place in the world, for us certainly in New Zealand. And I've always valued the clear separation between politics and their ability to govern, manage, and preside over that role as a conscience. So that's my perspective from a New Zealand governance perspective, yeah.
There are many people who are very disheartened and disturbed and concerned about what's happening in the United States right now, about democratic norms being ignored, or democracy even being dismantled. And I would love to ask you what so many people ask me. What can we do? I know you're a New Zealander, but you do live in America and you do care about democracy.
I do.
And democratic principles. And I think people are feeling so powerless and so and at such a loss. I feel that way, honestly. I'm trying to help explain what's happening to people. That's where I think I can be of service. But for people watching this, what would you say to them? How can you give them hope? Because I know that you say you're still optimistic, and you're saying optimism is not naive, it's hope. And you've quoted Lord Shackleton as well, saying optimism is moral courage.
It is.
But I have to be honest, it's hard to be optimistic now.
I completely understand that, but my fear is that without optimism, without that expectation, because that's how I see optimism. Optimism is an expectation that things can and should be better. And there's a moment that we lose that expectation, we run the risk of drifting into indifference. And we can't afford that either. In terms of, messages, and again, I am an observer, so I'm always careful to give these commentaries, but what I'm suggesting is possible is within your own history. When you think about the tumultuous times that we've gone through as global communities, the Great Depression, World War II, significant moments in time, and then, predating that, of course, a horrific pandemic in influenza that took out the same number of people. There's casualties in those wars. We've had very extreme and tumultuous times as humans before, and during that time, you had a president that many describe as an empathetic leader, an FDR, who during great complexity of the Great Depression, where perhaps it would have been easier just to resort to blame and fear, would engage in fireside chats, explaining to the American public not only what was going on and, you know, the economic wins, but what the response would be. These aren't lofty ideals that have never been implemented before. There is examples of it in America's own history, as long as people maintain an expectation of what they expect in leadership.
What are you most excited about when it comes to your future? I know that you'll stay in Boston for a while. Mm-hmm. How long do you think?
Oh, we're looking for, you know, always looking at what the next adventure will be. We're not going to be away from New Zealand forever. It's home. So we've always called this a little adventure, and the first one was meant to be 3 months. It just happens to have turned into 2 years, but New Zealand is still home.
And I've got a couple quick social questions. Do we have time to do just to run through them real quick? Will you ever come back to public service?
I still, in a way, feel like I'm in some kind of public service. I'm not campaigning for myself, but I'm campaigning for humanity.
What is your favorite Girl Scout cookie?
Oh, no, that has a story. Because in New Zealand, we have 2 types, plain and chocolate covered. And when I discovered there's this whole range, it has become a bit of a thing for me.
So what is your favorite?
I'm a great lover of the caramel delight. I ordered a box from my local chapter, and when I say a box, I mean a carton of like 6 different flavors, and the caramel delight is delicious.
Well, I'm a Thin Mint girl myself.
Oh, you're a Thin Mint in the freezer?
Yes, in the freezer. But I always eat the whole sleeve, and it's a real problem for me.
They're delicious.
Okay. How can we get America to elect a woman president?
Gosh, I'm just going to say this. It will happen in my lifetime. I believe it.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
I hope it happens in my lifetime too, Jacinda.
Yeah,
I'm a little older than you are. What has been your favorite profession?
And I say that as someone who does not much for my longevity. So that's my optimism.
Yeah. Maybe fewer caramel delights would be helpful. What is your favorite professional book or podcast?
Oh, do I expose my listening interest? Probably the podcast that I have listened to the most over the years is called Criminal. I love it. Phoebe Judge, amazing podcaster, amazing interviewer, such a calming voice. So I've listened to it for years. I love it.
Any books that you have really loved that made an impression on you?
I recently read Melinda French Gates' book, The Next Stage.
On transitions.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. Beautiful. And I also recently listened to the audiobook of The Bee Sting. It's such an incredible Irish storytelling. There's something so strong about Irish writers. And so The Bee Sting I highly recommend.
Well, it's been such a thrill, as I said, to meet you and talk to you, and congratulations on your book. It is like giving birth. I can attest to that, a different kind of power. Jacinda Ardern, your official title is the Honorable Dame? What do I have? What is your official title?
I even struggle to tell you because
Go ahead, tell me.
I prefer people not to use it. So even the mere fact you want me to say it is problematic for me. Officially, it would be the Right Honourable Dame Jacinda. It's too much. It's too much.
I'll just say Jacinda.
Thank you. I prefer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.